Hello, good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to a celebration stream. At least it's a celebration as far as I'm concerned, because LAWhammer, our lovely actual play of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplays, The Enemy Within, has just hit 50,000 views. Woo! Da, 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 da. Okay, right, we don't need to have me dancing. However, I am going to pour myself a little bit of a wee drink to celebrate. So what are we doing today? We are doing an Ask Andy Anything because, hey, why not? The theme for this one, though, very much is The Enemy Within, the Enemy Within campaign, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay as a whole. So if you have any questions about that, do feel free to drop them into the chat. Indeed, if you have questions about anything, feel free to drop it into the chat. And inevitably, if you do want to say congratulations for hitting 50k, we will very gratefully receive them. I'll be bringing up comments as we go. For example, hello, says Nico Devout, or alternatively, grat, says Old Man Zola. Things like that. I'll be bringing up comments as we go, and inevitably if anyone throws super chats in our direction, as in somebody's actually thrown some money over here towards the LAWhammer channel, we will gratefully accept that because I need to buy new mics. But beyond that, I will definitely bring the comment up regardless of what it says. So that being the case, let's dive through our comments and have a quick hello from everyone. First, Henrik drops in right at the very beginning. What is your experience with the other Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay campaigns like Doomstones, Paths of the Damned, and Thousand Thrones? Right, so for those of you who are aware of me, I started working on Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay at the very end of first edition and at the beginning of second edition. And at the end of first edition, I had played the Enemy Within campaign like too many times. Doomstones, though, I've only played a couple of times. Paths of the Damned was a campaign for the second edition of the game. And Paths of the Damned, first part written by Graham Davis, for example, my good buddy. That I've played through properly end to end only once. I've used the adventures and repitched them in different ways for other things, but only played it through once. The Thousand Thrones, equally, only played through that campaign end to end once. So in comparison to The Enemy Within, which was my go-to campaign whenever I had a new group or whenever someone else popped up, I have played the other ones barely at all. Having said that, though, I have read them and referenced them multiple times for a whole host of things. Like, for example, The Thousand Thrones, I did quite a bit of work on that. Paths of the Damned later books, I helped do some bits for that too. I was at that point doing all the mapping for pretty much everything, so I was reading every book as it came out, which was fun. Over to Aleph. Thank you very much, Aleph. Greatly appreciated. Since I've been reading McNeil's Held in Hammer trilogy, yes, any thoughts on that telling? Are the various not rune fangs of Shard, etc. in LAWhammer? So, Graham's version of Sigmar's story is great. It doesn't match up with lots of stuff that's in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And for people who are a fan of the bits that it contradicts, that causes some issues. I have always been, when I've created anything for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, someone who tries to take everything that's been written and go, okay, how can I make all of this through one route or another make sense? So if you have been keeping up with LAWhammer, Aleph, you'll notice that recently we headed up towards, and this isn't exactly a spoiler, it's something that's relatively well known for anyone who's read the Enemy Within campaign. So I'll mark it as a minor spoiler, but it's not really a spoiler at all. And that's that we headed up north towards Brass Keep. And it's fair to say that McNeil's version of Brass Keep was a very strong influence on how aspects of that location were portrayed inside LAWhammer. So the various not rune fangs and similar are very much a part of LAWhammer. Whether they'll ever actually come up in stream or not will depend entirely on what happens. I shall then drop down to Brock. Hey Brock, congrats on 50k. Thank you very much. I am delighted that we have had 50,000 views now on our first LAWhammer video. It's amazing. It's made me a very happy man. What's been your favourite or one of moments on LAWhammer as a DM so far? Ah, that's a toughie. there's a lot of them, and some of them are really rather mundane in comparison to the great funny ha 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 moments. One of my favorite bits was just watching all of the players on the very first episode attempting to come to grips with the fact that they were now doing it live. It's a completely different experience. For me, as well as them, we had been role-playing together as a group to ensure that we were comfortable with each other, and we were also comfortable role-playing our characters, which was quite important because most of us didn't know each other before we started this ridiculous endeavour. And I may have known Andy, and indeed worked with him in multiple books, and obviously I know Lindsay because she's my wife. But beyond that, it was a variety of we do or don't know these people very well. And in some cases, they were just strangers who turned up for our very first ever sessions, and seeing everybody getting down playing the game live was astonishing, and that was one of my favorite moments. And I know that's really dull because it's just we turned up one day and did it in front of cameras, but it was really good to see that. One of my more enjoyable moments was watching them try to figure out how to deal with Wittgenstein's castle, and not just arriving at the place, but dealing with the moral hellhole that that place represented once they became more aware of what was going down. And I am to this day stunned at how it has unfolded as we've moved past that, which I think is the next thing which is worth saying, Brock 6000, and in general to everyone else. There may be spoilers through the course of this stream for the LAWhammer campaign, and I will be answering questions about that campaign throughout this. If there are, though, I will clearly mark them before they come, and I will be very quick about whatever may or may not be a spoiler. So the Wittgenstein castle reveal was a fun one. Another one that I know is going to be particularly fun is coming next week, this Friday, the next Friday that we're about to arrive at. I've been waiting for this one for about 5 years. The idea was originally pitched by me to Graham all the way back in about 2019, where we were discussing what to do with the Horned Rat, which is the fourth part of the Enemy Within campaign. And Graham had ideas for what he wanted, which was to try and take some of the ideas that were originally put together for what the Horned Rat campaign may be. And I had some ideas for how we could resolve aspects of the ongoing Enemy Within campaign that had never been resolved in the first edition version of it. And I pitched it to him, and his initial response was excitement at what was being said, and also horror because it referenced an old source that he personally didn't like. I can't really talk about it yet because it's a spoiler for what's to come, but I will say I'm really looking forward to that. But as is often the case with being a DM, it's often the little moments that are the best bits, the bits where you see characters really shine and show who they are. And I could do that for all 6 of them, whether it's delving into the Nipponese stuff with Sage's character, whether it is diving deep into the Bright College as we're dealing with Dan's character, alternatively the hijinks that Gerhardt gets up to when we're dealing with Ed's character, looking at the Cult of Sigmar in a very different way with, for example, Andy's character, or indeed taking a look at some of the loathsome creatures that live beneath the earth with Birdie, who is Kath's character. We've had an opportunity with each of them. I particularly enjoyed some of the elf bits, to look at lots of different things, and for me that's been a far better. And I know I spent a bit more time in that than I probably should have, given there's been so many questions in, but I do think it's worthwhile because I've really enjoyed the campaign so far. Overall, it's been an absolute laugh. I will also note that we might get a lot of super chats in, because sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. If we do, I will definitely get back to other questions, so if you can't throw super chats our way, don't worry. And if you do want to ask questions, do post them. Make sure you mark a quick Q at the beginning so I spot them, or an at LAWhammering. So I'm going to go diving back into them again. I will, however, run back to those ones if necessary. Congrats, Andy, says Quinn. Thank you very much. We love you so much. Oh, who has been your favourite PC to write story hooks tales of for in LAWhammer? It's like trying to pick between your babies. That's cruel. I remember, I'm going to take this question slightly differently. when I was first planning out how we were going to do the LAWhammer version of the Enemy Within campaign, I wanted to give an idea of what it was like to play at the table and to play at home in a way that, say, larger campaigns out there didn't do, and a way that many online campaigns simply avoided. Because often when you're doing games at home, at least when I'm running them, there is lots of extra depth that gets added to it, whether it's backstory or sitting down with someone discussing it out or whatever else it might be. And I pitched to everyone, all the players, that we would have side streams, an opportunity for people to delve deep into their characters, often on one-on-one, sometimes 2 or 3 PCs in a smaller group working at once. And this was a way that we could delve into the deeper stories of their background, all of which were related through to the Enemy Within campaign. So if we take a look at Alaminawai, spoilers! She is chasing the Enemy Within campaign's core plot as a very odd elf. If we look at, say, the father, his very first side stream sends him off towards becoming a seer. If we look over towards Gerhardt, we learn everything about the big civil war that's about to come, and we learn about the Trots and the Thames through his first one. The first one with Elric was an exploration into how bad it's going to get with the colleges of magic when the shit comes to hit the fan later. Our first stream with Birdie was to show just how much the Skaven were going to be a core influence in what was going to be coming. Indeed, each one of the side stories added so much extra fun detail to the campaign that it's really difficult to say any of them have been my favorite per se. Of course, we have favorite moments, and we always have characters that we enjoy portraying, but I find that my tastes change over time. A character that I enjoy one session, I might not the next, and a character I wasn't enjoying to begin with comes to be relatively important to the overall story, and I start enjoying playing them in ways I might not have originally realized, especially when they take on new aspects that were never expected. I'll pick out one character in particular for that, and that would be Margarita, who I did not expect to be alive. I won't give the last name because it's sort of a spoiler, but for those of you who watched, you know exactly who I mean. I didn't expect her to be alive, regardless of what our version was, and you'll notice the picture of her inside our episode cards comes hand in hand with the Heir to Nagash title, and that tells a story in and of itself. And I expected her to be effectively dead, or at the very least relegated to bad guy status and somehow working as an antagonist. As it turns out, the opposite was the case through the interactions between the PCs and the NPCs. So the bits I've enjoyed most is watching the story go in directions I didn't expect. So less the parts of the story hooks that I've been writing. Barnum Bastard! Oh, thank you very much for the super chat there. Congratulations on 50,000. Thank you very much. From a complete lore perspective and the implications it would have, what is your favorite Total War Warhammer campaign? That's actually a toughie, Barn. I'm going to take a little drink while I consider that. I really like, as may be relatively obvious if you've watched LAWhammer, I really like the advisor's overall story. I thought he was a fun character, and for the LAWhammer version of him, I've rewritten him and added extra background. For those of you caught up with it all, you'll be broadly aware of what that is, but I explain not just what college he came from, but what his name was, where he had come from, and who he was tied to in the greater overall story. And in some respects, his plot lines, and particularly when we look at Warhammer 3 and the plot lines that, Total War 3, pardon me, that he largely has put in place there, have been the strongest influence on my personal campaign out of the 3. So I would probably go the various plot lines that are presented in that game. Because, yeah. Moving down. Hi, Andy. Hiya. Really enjoyed my copy of Dark Deeds. Yes, and I do love it when someone brings up Dark Deeds. Oh, this is the production copy. This isn't actually a copy you could buy. It's very similar to the copy you could buy. Where's the copy you can buy? Oh, it's also back there. But this is my production copy, my special copy I got sent before the game was actually ready to print. As in, it was ready to print, but we were checking it to make sure everything worked. We changed some of the innards after seeing the production copy. But yes, you can buy your own copy of Dark Deeds if you wish. You can go buy that over at madifius.co.uk. We have some streams about Dark Deeds somewhere. I think we did a nice stream over on Inside the Rookery. So if you'd like to know more about Dark Deeds, go check out our stream over on Inside the Rookery. On that, after this stream, which I'll just bring up. After the stream, I'm doing a stream over on Inside the Rookery at 7 p.m. So that's when we're finished here. I'm going to dive straight over onto Inside the Rookery at 7 p.m. And we're talking about revolutions in your role-playing games, which I think is one of the most Warhammer Fantasy roleplay subjects you can have, particularly because Warhammer Fantasy roleplay moved away from that, but it started very much with it. So I think there's a really, really cool discussion to have there. It'll be me, Andy, Lindsay, and of course Mark Gibbons talking about that 7 p.m. But we'll get to that after. Anyway, moving on to your question. Thanks a ton. Are you popping by Toledo, Ohio anytime soon? Not anytime soon. I'd love a signature for my copy. Is tomorrow's stream still on schedule? It absolutely is. When I'm not going to get political, but I avoided America for a while, a few years back, and I'm avoiding America just now, particularly given that I'm also someone who's a businessman who doesn't like the idea of having tariffs slapped upon anything that he might send over towards that side of the world. So yeah, I'm not going anytime soon, but if you happen to be over here, I will be happy to sign anything that you might have. Baroque 6000, in past Lorebeard streams, you've been particular about how and when the word worship is used. Seems it's used loosely. Can you expound on that a bit? Yes, I can. In Warhammer, worship is not necessarily as we understand it in our very almost monotheistic view of the world in modern times. There are many cultures that are polytheistic in the world, and many of them perhaps have a closer relationship to the word worship as it would be understood inside the Warhammer world than we have here. It is relatively rare in the Warhammer world as a whole, outside of the Chaos Gods, for people to worship a god, even amongst some of the priesthoods, and that might come as relatively controversial. They don't necessarily worship the gods. They are representatives to the gods. They are there to appeal to the gods in times of need and often enact deeds in a fashion that will please the gods. That doesn't necessarily mean worship. Appeasement is quite different to worship. And if you're in a polytheistic realm where all of these gods are real, you don't just sit there going, for example, I'm from Talabic land, Tal is my life. Yeah, no, he's a part of your life, as are all the other gods. The Empire, for example, has 10 primary theologies that everyone's quite aware of, but it has significantly more than that besides. And if you are feeling like retribution is exceedingly important to you, and you are, say, from Stirland, you will almost certainly be appealing to Sepul, the god of revenge and retribution. If you're a tailor who's desperate to make a perfect piece, you might be sending out your making offerings would be a best way of putting it. We even put that inside the core book to make sure it was relatively clear. You would make offerings to that god to try and hopefully attract their attention and receive their blessing, or as is often more the case in Warhammer, to avoid attention, because getting the attention of a god is often bad news because they're pissed and you need to do something to appease them, so you then give them offerings. Most of your time in the Warhammer world is not spent worshipping a deity because that's the god that you think is important. Most of your time is spent giving offerings to deities to appease them so they don't turn their eye to you. The offerings to Mor, for example, are very much that. You don't want Mor in your life because that means death is coming. Offerings to Shalia are sometimes the opposite, because Shalia is the goddess of mercy, and if you're in a time of great need, you might make offerings to Shalia. It's a polytheistic world, and all of the gods, as they are represented in each one of the communities, are as important as each other. Now, obviously, Sigmar holds a very core place within the Empire, and Sigmar to a degree, because it's wrapped up in the nobility and it's wrapped up in what it is to be an imperial citizen, comes hand in hand with what many would appear to see as worship, particularly because every festag, a significant number of people in the empire will move to their local temple, where they will be preached to by a priest of Sigmar about what it means to be a citizen of the empire, the things you should do, the things you shouldn't do, the great stories of Sigmar and his deeds of First Empire, why it's important that we listen to the Elector Counts as representatives of Sigmar, and importantly, the Emperor also. But again, it's not so much worship as we understand it today, because they're not saying this is the one true God or anything similar, or I must immediately bow down and do this for this God every week. This is all about being a good imperial citizen. It's about being a good citizen than it is necessarily worship. Having said that, though, there are many fanatics, many who dedicate themselves to one of the gods, and through doing so, and often through emulation, by doing what they think that god desperately wants to see happen, often by enacting deeds that they think are representative of what that god does, they attempt to bring attention to a god. This often happens to individuals who have gone through some extreme issue, causing them to then turn to one god or another and dedicate themselves, swear themselves to that god, so that they can receive nothing but benefits in return from that god by effectively becoming an extremist. And in many respects, that's what anyone who calls themselves a worshipper of a god is. They are extremists. They are people who go far too far in one direction or another. Many of the clergy are extremists, but not all. Most of them, and this goes contrary to how many writers use it, but this is very much the case. Most of the clergy are also polytheistic. Many of them would not just simply be looking towards their own god when it comes to issues. Say, for example, you're a local priest of Sigmar and the crops are failing. You're not praying to Sigmar for your local community. You'll be telling them that the people they need to turn to is whatever your local god of fertility is going to be, and bringing about the crops. It's most typically perceived in most parts of the empire as Raya, who is epitomized by a sheaf of wheat. That's often one of her most common symbols. However, you'll find different parts of the empire have got either different names for Raya, or it's just a different deity, whether that's Dryath or whether that's, oh gosh, there's lots of them. So cut a long story short, worship is not necessarily the best word to use for Warhammer, because that suggests a certain level of devotion that is exceedingly rare, particularly because the gods are terrifying. Most people are much more in the business of appeasing the gods. Wow, that took a wee while. Hope that helped a bit there, Brock. Gonna run down to Marathi. Hey, Marathi! Always nice to see Marathi dropping into a stream. You've told a few stories where another writer did something a bit ignorant and you told them off. Are there any times someone did that to you? Yes, particularly in my early days of Warhammer writing. If we turn to, say, the Tome of Salvation... Actually, no, that's a bit of a lie. Tell off is extreme. I had one note on my very first article, which was just simply, can we add an additional pun here, which was nice because Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition was relatively po-faced. It didn't use much in the way of humour in its writing, and it was very much almost an editorial line. It was more the 6th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battle that was being replicated, and that was a far grimmer edition in comparison to the 5th edition that had come before, which was almost cartoony. And we were moving away from that, and we were requested as writers to also move away from that. So I had a note there. In the Tome of Salvation, there was quite a few notes because we were tackling a host of subjects that were entirely new. None of the notes were about lore or using lore correctly, because fortunately I knew it. It was more, how do we best present this? How do we best present that? And indeed, I even received a cut inside the Tome of Salvation. Now, I personally cut a lot of my own work, and that book I did about, I think I wrote about 100k. I self-edited down to about 60, 75k, and about 64k of my words were used in the final book, as off the top of my head. But one of the cuts I had was about the solar system of the Warhammer world, largely because Games Workshop weren't entirely sure at that point whether they wanted to have that written in black and white. because they weren't sure. Now, I sent a note back saying everything I've included comes from these sources. I sourced everything, and I said these things are already real. So it's already been marked, but they've been marked in novels and similar. And novel sources are generally not perceived to be prime sources for Warhammer. So they went, yeah, let's just not. So that never got used. I've been commissioned to write that bit. I got paid for it, but it never got used. But generally speaking, most of the notes that I had were more about how can we best present this thing or another. Very rarely was it a lore thing, because I'd owned every book, read them back to front. Often I was more aware of the lore than the person that I was sending the work to on the other side. But that's why I was employed. That's not a way to be big-headed. That's just me saying that's why they employed me to do this. I was very much, to use a single word, the IP guy, the intellectual property guy. I knew the Warhammer world back to front. So whenever there was if there was uncertainty rather than certain, let's go that route. When there was uncertainty about lore points, they often contacted me and said, what is this? And I would send a quick note back saying, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this, it's this. And these are the sources. And you can do obviously whatever they wanted with it, because in the end, you can contradict your own sources when it's yours. So yeah, I wasn't told off, so to speak, but I definitely had a lot of notes on several of the things that I wrote. The later stuff, once I realized what they were looking for and how they wanted things pitched, it pretty much went through without edit or note or concern. Generally just a big thumbs up and thanks very much, which was nice. So say, for example, the stuff that I did for Shades of Empire or the Realms of the Ice Queen book or whatever else, all of that just kind of went through, and that was really nice. There's nothing like having something go through first time to put a big smile on your face. That's never a certainty, though, no matter who you are dealing with and no matter how well you know the lore, because it's very possible that the people that's commissioned you have already commissioned other people to add certain pieces, and you might have contradicted that, and they might prefer the other piece of writing. So having words change after they've been sent in is not at all uncommon in roleplay writing. Watchdog, what race do you think would the most jarring to meet in person to expectations? So what race would be the most jarring to meet? Elves. Absolutely elves. Maybe dwarves. No, elves. Maybe. Elves. Now, give me a little bit of think there. I had a lovely discussion with Gav Thorpe about these and exactly where the elves sit. Now, Gav Thorpe is a great fan of dwarfs. He much prefers dwarfs. Doesn't like the elves much at all, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't world build like a bastard and build really cool version of what elves are. And Warhammer elves, underneath Gav's guidance, received quite the upgrade over the initial view of how the elves were presented back in the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the first High Elf Army list. So Bill King presented a version of elves, and then Gav Thorpe developed them further and moved them into a far more emotional place than they were originally. Far, far so. Making them eternal teenagers, effectively. And speaking of the ennui of effectively eternal life and how it doesn't impact them, what they are, why they are the way they are, their natural grace, their natural arrogance, their natural everything that we read about, but I think actually seeing them would surprise a lot, particularly given that the only elves that we've ever had on screen are almost always played by humans for very good reason, because that's what the actors are, leaving them chunky and slow and uncertain by comparison to the descriptions that we've had in the various novels and the developments that Warhammer elves have had over other elves in other fantasy settings. The dwarves pretty much land where most people expect dwarves to be, perhaps a little bit more rigid, perhaps a little bit less metaphorical in how they approach, a bit more direct than many people expect, but they are definitely within the mental spectrum of humanity. They would just be neurodivergent by humanity standards. Their base value is very neurodivergent in comparison to a human base value, where the elves go beyond simple neurodivergence into a completely different place, and physically they're completely different as well. And that's something that I think would definitely show a viewer to meet them. Charles CK, which of the PC characters evolved in ways that were most outside of your early expectations? How so? Congratulations for the views. Gerhardt. This one's pretty easy. Elric is largely where I expected Elric to be almost from the beginning. Birdie is also largely where I expected her to be, as much as that may be a surprise for those of you caught up with where she is. Given everything that I was aware of what she was and where her family was from and exactly what was what, she's where I expected. Leopold is... Whilst Andy made a choice at the beginning that took him in a slightly different direction, ultimately he's a warrior priest of Sigmar. So there's not an enormous amount of difference there. Alemenawith is stuck on a path. She can't be anything but what I expected from the beginning. She has no choice. She is so fixed on that. She is stuck. So not a surprise at all. Yume is going largely where I expected and will continue in that direction. I continue to expect, but Gerhardt, he ended up going down a completely different route, was entirely driven by Ed. When he was looking at this, the character that we were initially discussing, he immediately put it in a slightly different direction to what I initially expected the character to be, and that was good because it's Ed's character. And then from there and through play, Ed went, no, I'm looking for extra utility for Gerhardt, so I'm now going to take him down a different route entirely. And that left him with what I thought was marvelous side episode up in Altdorf on his second Tales of Altdorf City, when he went through the university and finished off a degree. And I was very happy with the changes that were made on top of that. We had extra discussions as to other potential changes, and yeah, Gerhardt's the one who is most clearly going in a different direction to expectations. Brock 6000, thank you very much for the super chat, enormously appreciated. Is there any particular piece of Warhammer art that has inspired you to create a plot point, location, lore bit, or character for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and why? The answer to this, Brock, is yes, 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 so many, yes, yes, so many, and yes. Whenever I see a new piece of Warhammer art, my first thoughts are almost always, what is that? How can I use that? How does this change things? What do I do with that? And I'll give my very first example. The first time that I diverged from the canon that Warhammer presented and built my own version. And that's when I received the 4th edition of the Warhammer Fantasy Battle High Elf Army list. And the Swordmasters of Hoth were in there. Mark Gibbons, who I'm going to be speaking to in about an hour over on the Inside the Rookery channel. So do come and join us. We're talking about revolutions in your roleplay games. An accidental plug there. Mark Gibbons have made the Swordmaster of Hoth art. It's a very famous piece of art in that army list. It's black and white and it has the White Tower of Hoth in the background. And I looked at that White Tower and I went, yeah, this isn't good enough. I'm doing more. So I made myself an entirely new career for Swordmasters of Hoth, and this back in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st edition. I lore Masters of Hoth, what they were, and from there I created an entire new set of stuff for the White Tower and how it worked over in Safri. And that completely changed my perspective on elves, because as you create new material, it adds depth and you have to justify why certain things happen. And that means you need to have the thought processes of the people involved. How did it all come to pass? And that in and of itself changed my views on elves. So that's my first one, but I can pretty much say that for most pieces of art. The Dragon Princess of Calidor, in exactly the same book, did exactly the same thing to me as well. Again, another piece by Mark Gibbons. Truly gorgeous black and white piece of a dragon prince, but no longer on a dragon because the dragons had gone to sleep. So they were riding heavily barded elven steeds instead. So yeah, lots is the answer to that one. Hey, Dino Man! Hi Andy, hi in return. Congratulations on 50k. Thank you very much. 50,000 people have now watched our first video. Earlier today, I found out about Rupesh VII and saw that since he was adopted by the Queen of Lybaris, who was infertile, there's a chance that Kalida is actually part dwarf. Yeah, no. Personally, I think it's more likely that he just had no kids and the line passed to his adopted cousins, as sapient hybrids aren't usually a thing outside of the Dragons of Cathay. Also, the adoption of Dwarf Tomb King seems like he should be mentioned more. Yeah, that's one of those little side pieces of silly lore that rarely gets brought up because it's considered to be a bit daft by most quarters. But I do think it's worth jumping on the potential here of different species breeding in the Warhammer world. I've discussed this in several other streams, but it is worth noting again. It's not just sapient hybrids aren't a thing. They are, giving the genes of the different species, impossible. But It's the Warhammer world where there's magic, so a great influx of Gyron, for example, the Jade Winds of magic, can make almost anything fertile to almost anything else. Chaos is gonna chaos after all. So for every time I'll say, no, you can't get a hybrid, there will be, say, a half-elf, half-human character snuck away inside a Black Library novel somewhere, and I can justify that and make it work within the setting, even though the hard and fast rules I was given by the studio, given by Black Industries, who were the Black Library imprint for role-playing games. In fact, given every time I've written for the game is never ever do a cross species. It can't happen. We don't have half halflings, half dwarves. We don't have half dwarfs, half humans. They cannot and will not. Well, they may breed. They may be fucking all over the place. That's a very different thing, but they cannot bring about children, not even sterile children. So do not be doing this as something for your various NPCs in your books. Ever. It's one of the few hard and fast rules I was ever given. Having said that, though, it being the Warhammer world, these hard and fast rules you can always break through one route or another. Rockabye Jukebox. Hey, thank you very much. Hello, Andy. Hello. I noticed the new the old world map for Estalian cities and towns named with the Sam Blank naming, which means the town was named after a saint of Catholic faith, in real life, Saints of Myrmidia. So, yeah, the Estalian map, as it was last presented, had fan material included in it, but it was made by a Warhammer writer, so it's not entirely 100% fanish, but it came from a map by Andreas Blucher, as I recall, which was based on Mad Alfred's maps. He wrote the Stone and Steel book from Fantasy Roleplay First Edition, for example, and it includes fan material. So first, it wouldn't surprise me if this changes, because I don't know if Games Workshop know they included fan material, but they took the map offline, so perhaps they do. So that's point number one. But point number two, there are Saints of Myrmidia, so that would be entirely fine. I wrote about some of them inside the Tome of Salvation. I handled all of the Myrmidia material in that. I significantly expanded upon Myrmidia as she currently was before, and there are a host of figures who are exceedingly important to Myrmidia and saints all over the place. So that is not a problematic element of the map. It's not something I'd be too worried about. Moving down to Dynaman. Do you think that the southern gate of Calith is under near constant attack from Chaos, or do you think that there is some sort of culture in the land south of that land that is non-Chaos aligned, perhaps something based on Australian Aboriginal peoples? There is always space for Warhammer to do that, and I think it arguably should be done. One of the biggest issues with Warhammer is always that it's exceedingly monolithic with its cultures, and there just aren't that many of them, because ultimately their cultures build towards armies, and they don't want to have that many armies because heck, it makes the game complicated to produce and expensive, and they only want to have about 10 to 14 core factions. That'll do just fine. We don't need more. Having said that, the roleplay side is always adding depth. And if I was doing this, then I would be doing not necessarily this, as in not necessarily Australian, Aboriginal, or anything similar, but I would definitely be looking at the cultures that have built around the Southern Gate, because it's very different to the Northern Gate. And I do think that it would be fun to dive into that to some degree. Quinn, what's been your favourite 4E book? I am exceedingly biased on this one, and I'm happy to admit it. It's the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay Starter Set, and that's purely because it was the first book that, for all I didn't have as much control over as I would have liked, but it was the first book that I actually had some measure of proper control over, end to end. So rather than being commissioned to do a job and doing whatever somebody else told me to do, I was in the position of largely deciding what was in it. Now, would I have done it differently if I had complete control? Yes, I'd have put a small rule book in there, for example. It would have had a rule book, an adventure book, and a background setting book. It would have had 3 books, not the 2 books it had. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed to do that. Unfortunately, I was told to do something quite different, so I did something quite different. But for me, that book is, that box set actually, is by far my favourite. For all other books, do other things. But yeah, starter set. It's always fun. Dynaman, I just had this experience with the DM of the Genesis campaign I'm playing in. I'm wondering if you had something similar. My character has secretly been given information that puts him in a very difficult moral position that impacts other characters. Later in the week, I met the DM in person and said, name, I say this with affection, you get. Yeah, this happens all the time. Particularly because I was playing, I'm a long-term GM, DM, storyteller of various games, and some games are designed to pitch your players against each other, and making difficult moral positions being a core component of the stories being told. I'll call out one game for this, Vampire the Masquerade, one I played for. I had one campaign last 10 years real time, and this is a core component of it. The best way of always handling these things is with communication, which means that all the players should be aware that these are the sort of things that can happen, and there should be open communication between both players and whoever's running the game to ensure that if decisions are made that others don't like, that doesn't breed bad blood or discomfort, and instead does the opposite, makes everybody perhaps have bad blood in time, but out of time it's part of the cool stories that you're building, so it's a good thing. But yeah, definitely that's a thing that happens. Hey Quentin, excited, sad to think that the Enemy Within will eventually end? Yes, it will. We can still expect plenty of roleplay content from you and the crew after, right? I hope so, Quinn. We are significantly through the Enemy Within campaign. We're on the second part of the fourth part of the campaign. So there's 5 parts of the Enemy Within, and we've just entered into the second part. Literally last episode. Next episode will be the second episode in that. This part could take it could take anything from like 3 weeks up to however long it takes them to resolve everything that they're doing. I've had some parts of this campaign that I expected to be over in like 3 sessions take 7 or 8. I've had some parts that I expected to take 7 or 8 to be done in like 2 because they skip stuff. And I'm cool with that. I'm not forcing the story. I'm letting them go where they want to go. And I'm often allowing dice to keep things fresh, because I've run this campaign so many times in so many different ways. It's fun for me not to know what's coming next. So I often randomize particular encounters that they come face to face with. Having said that though, yes, it is coming to an end. Empire in Ruins, our version of that is going to be starting very soon, and that's the last part of the campaign. I have no idea how it's going to go or how long that's going to take. When it's done, if our players are still happy carrying on, we will. But only if they are. I don't want to put pressure upon them. I don't want them to feel pressure to do that. They might have other things they want to do with their lives. They might want to move on to something completely different. They might want to do more. They might be caught up with their characters or just want to try out a new character. And if they do, I have another campaign already written and good to go. Gav Thorpe and I wrote a campaign called Pass of the Old Ones that we were going to write for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. But we didn't, because I left the production job and Gav decided not to continue on without me. So that being the case, I have an entire campaign that was meant to be a follow-up to The Enemy Within that I can use. Games Workshop never bought it. It's very much Gav and ours. And I asked Gav, do you mind if I run it? And he was like, yeah, go wild, have fun with it. So that will likely be happening if we agree to continue moving forwards. I would like to think that that will happen because I'm enjoying myself immensely just now, but who knows where I'll be in a year's time. Still loading! Andy, hello. Hope you're well. I am indeed quite well. Not everyone in my family is, but I am. I'm writing a story about a surgeon, in training, who finds an evil heart in a body and keeps it. How could this story go in Warhammer Fantasy? Very well, actually, still loading. In fact, there's an adventure hook inside the Drachenfels book. Now, that's not the Drachenfels novel, that's the Drachenfels adventure book for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1 called I Left My Heart in Castle Drachenfels. And I refer you to that because I think that makes for quite a fun potential aside there. That'd be good. Charles C.K., thank you very much. In universe, does the Empire call itself the Empire? Does it? The Empire was problematic right from the very beginning. This has been an issue for writers all the way through. The current Old World name is the Empire of Man, a name that I personally hate because regardless of the fact that Man would have been an entirely fine title for back in the day, nowadays it comes hand in hand with perceptions of sexism, and there's no need to call it that if you want to avoid that language. And I would prefer to avoid the language if I could, but they just dive straight into it. So the Empire of Man is one answer to this. Sigmar's Empire is another example. It is obviously a reference to the Holy Roman Empire in the real world, and various writers at some points have attempted to call it something similar. Holy Sigmar's Empire or some equivalent mumbled mix-up of words. But generally speaking, all the folks in the Empire just refer to it as the Empire. It's also worth noting that during the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, we were not allowed to call people from the Empire Imperial at all, under any circumstance. They were not Imperials. They were folk of the Empire. It was always of the Empire. And that's something that I kind of can't get away from because it was drilled into me over 10 years. So whenever I see anyone say Imperials, I shudder, because that's very much what we were told not to do back in the day. But yes, you're right. It is a little silly, and it speaks to a lack of world building during the initial area of the development of the Empire, all the way back in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1, where there were no other empires that they really needed to worry about that sat around, and it was just the Empire. Who cares? Sigmar at that point wasn't even important. It wasn't really, although Sigmar, when they brought out the first part of the Enemy Within campaign, was entirely attached to the Empire. It was not in any way meant to be Sigmar's empire per se for that, or was it? Well, it is now. Yeah, the whole thing is it needs a bit of development, and if I'd written the Empire book, I probably would have given it a lovely discussion about why there was conflicting views in the Empire as to what it should be called, and what the courts in Reichland say, and why different courts use different titles, and how Magnus settled one 200 years ago. Because Magnus the Pious is the great one for doing that throughout. Hi Andy, hi, I'm the side. Are you aware of any Warhammer Fantasy filking communities? I haven't found any. Would love to make Warhammer songs with people though. I'm not. I'm sure there's some out there, but I am not, which is amusing given that it's something you'd expect. Sorry, can't help. I've written many a song myself, but yeah, no, sorry on the side, not too much use there. Wallace and Gromit could survive anything, Singemeister. Right, so as promised, I'm going to dive back and pull out all those questions. And as I said, if you drop a Q on it, I'm much more likely to catch it as I scroll through. I will bring up this one though. Hi and congrats. Would you tell us more about the common folk of Sylvania? As a Romanian, I'm morbidly curious. The wiki sums the place up as a backwater of superstitious people terrified of death. And that's not too far away from how it's generally been described. If you're wanting to have a more in-depth look into how Sylvania's day-to-day life might appear, pop over to a book called Night's Dark Masters for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. It's basically the vampire book for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and in there's a good chunk about Sylvania. There's a big map. I did the map in that book. It's a book by Jody McGregor and Steve Darlington, both of whom are awesome. I met Jody when he was last over here in Edinburgh, actually. And Steve has been over on Inside the Rookery a couple of times as well, because Steve is awesome. He also popped over to Lorebeards as well. He did quite a lot of work on halflings, which is right beside Sylvania. But loosely speaking, they are officially Stirlanders. So go check up Stirland if you want to know more about Stirland in general. And they are very much as you described. But I would suggest if you want to go read a bit more, Night's Dark Masters is where to go. Just going to drop up a few congratulations because it's now, since watching the first episode, now DMing the second book. Brilliant, Declan. Delighted to hear that. A big Hoppit, congratulations. Thank you. Very nice. Oh, seriously? A beautiful man, Christian. Thank you very much. I'll just adjust my non-existent tie here. Heron pops up with the grats. Thank you very much. How many mics have you gone through so far? We've gone through 3. And the mics we have now are good. I just need another one of them. We went through the first mics that we used for our first however many sessions. They simply were not good enough. And if you dial into any of our initial episodes, you'll see why. In exclusion, without hearing them beside anything else, I mean, you can hear everything that's going on. They're fine. I replaced those with a different set of mics, and they ended up being little better for all they were a good bit more expensive. We used those for a few more sessions, and then I brought in Lindsay's brother, who works for the BBC, and we had a big long conversation. I bought a completely different set of mics, and they worked a lot better. I bought a new soundboard to work those, but they ended up being not as good as I hoped, and it wasn't the mics that were the problem, it's how we were handling them. We about 3 months ago, completely rejigged the sound behind the scenes in an attempt to fix it, and it fixed most of the problems, but it added new ones. And we've been twiddling through that for the last about 3 months. I thought I'd fixed it over the Christmas period. Our first session, which was the New Year's special one, which was the big board game, it was terrible. The sound just went wrong. And I fixed it just last week for the most recent episode, and it was smooth. It did exactly what I wanted. There was only one issue, and that's when our production goblin, Aaron, switched from one camera to another. We ended up getting some lag in the system, and I don't know why. So I've got lag in my system just now that I need to get rid of. I need one more mic as a secondary mic for myself at the side, and those mics are stupendously expensive. We currently have, what, 7 of those? That put me back. Like, we get so much money from Patreon every month, and a month's worth of Patreon does not give us enough for one of our mics. So I'm about to buy another one to add to the current system. Once that's done, we're going to be adding some extra monitoring inside, and then if we get that all in place, the next job is to rejig again all of the video that we have behind the scenes. We have one major issue with our above camera looking downwards, because no matter which camera I try, I've gone through 7. They just don't cut it for the detail level that we require for viewing down onto the battlefields or to the various tokens we're using, which leaves everything a bit blurry and a bit uncertain. And I will find a camera that works. I was just speaking to the cast just this last Friday, and some extra ideas were brought up to try and fix the current one that we have, which wasn't cheap, and I'm really upset that it's not doing as much as I would have liked. But yeah, we'll get there eventually. I'm sure it's almost there. Probably down to Rock. Oh, you know what? I don't know. I'll ask Andy when, because Andy was doing all of the messaging out to everyone. We were going to be asking Mike Pondsmith to pop over into Rookie Streams at some point, I believe. If you don't know Mike Pondsmith, the fantastic mind behind Cyberpunk, a game I have played since I was a kid and I deeply love. Particularly pleased with the new game, unlike many who didn't for one reason or another. I liked it almost from the beginning, and when they upgraded everything, it removed all the issues I had as well. So yeah, I rather like the game. Mornington Crescent, you mentioned the World of Darkness with Vampire. I did. As games are released and re-released, you find groups in them shift their focus, like the Technocracy Mage, from out-and-out fascists to their current status as socially liberal authoritarians. Do you find that groups being rewritten through editions have new versions accepted or fought against? Both. And this is one of the roots that lie behind the great growth of edition wars, where people have preferences for one edition of a game over another because of rule changes, background changes, or any other equivalent. I can't say that there's been any edition of any game that I have either worked on or played that hasn't had a new edition come along that has both been vilified and loved in often equal measure, or at least as stridently online. And if we're going to stick to the general Warhammer 3 theme, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition is a fine example of this. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd Edition was controversial, immensely controversial when it was released by FFG, because it moved away from the D100 system that had been used previously by Warhammer. I'm going to move that out of the way so you can see me. By the previous editions of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and had gone with a dice pool symbol pool system with loads of cards, leaving it feeling somewhat like a card game through play, and it was hated by the existing fan base, except for some who loved it, and a lot of new players adored it. I had a lovely conversation with Jay Little, who was the person who was behind creating it, over on the Rookery. If you go check the Rookery stream, so that's inside the Rookery, there's a developer chat, which is me, Graham Davis, James Wallace, Chris Pramus, and of course Jay as well. So that was developers of 1st all the way through to 4th edition Warhammer, and we're talking about the way the different versions of the game were received, created, and similar. But yeah, it goes both ways, if I'm being absolutely honest. I'm going to say your name wrong. Netantuel? give it a go. Apologies if I got that wrong. First, thanks very much for the super chat. Bringing modern 21st century sensibilities such as gender, language, and pronouns into any work of fiction inspired medieval European fantasy is what some people would call woke bullshit. I agree with those people. I don't. And I'll explain why I don't. Because, number one, medieval European fantasy is not medieval European. It's fantasy that uses some of those things, but not all of those things, because a lot of the things it uses are completely new. And the people that are playing those games are not coming from that world. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't use that language for games that are very much focusing in on, say, for example, inequalities. If you've got a game that's very much focused on inequalities and how things were different back during the medieval era for different genders, different expressions of people, then absolutely that should be a core component of the language used. And it should also probably come with warnings for people who might not expect it, because it's important that you don't alienate half your customer base. Having said that, though, if you're just dealing with, and the important word here is fantasy, that you're attempting to push out to as many people as possible and they can then enjoy, there is no reason to use that language, because if you come from, for example, the Empire, which isn't as sexist, just to use one of the Ests, as the Warhammer world, because it has real goddesses who empower women to positions of status in a way that couldn't happen in the real world. Their gender equality in the Warhammer world is much more equal than it ever was in any medieval European fantasy and medieval European real world version. You'd have to go all the way back to almost a classical era to get something that's similar. And that sort of makes sense, because if you go all the way back to the classical era, we then have a variety of different gods that do very different things. But we move into medieval and only use medieval stuff. We are now in a very male-dominated individual church, which is again very male dominated in a position of control and authority, that has been repurposed again and again and again to reinforce certain power structures. Those power structures don't exist in Warhammer in the same way. So the language you use should reinforce that. It has nothing to do with woke bullshit at all. It's all to do with about portraying that setting in the accurate and most appropriate way that you can, and also doing it in a fashion that doesn't alienate all of the readers. And if you do it well, the people who don't like woke bullshit don't notice, because it's just written well. And the people who are sensitive to woke bullshit and it not being there, they also kind of don't notice. They just go, oh wow, this is a really good setting, and all the things I don't like don't appear to be here. Well, and the people on the other side who perhaps just don't like that sort of thing, they just read it for what it is. So I strongly disagree with the point, while simultaneously also agreeing with the point. It's all about the type of game that you're attempting to push out there. After all, woke is nothing more than being open to the fact that the world is complicated and that there's lots of different types of people and not everybody's white. And I have no problems with, for example, writing a game that is as welcoming to Asian people or black people in a way that, for example, portions of Europe absolutely weren't. And the Empire isn't Europe and never was. No, I'll retract a bit. Was for a while, but then got written in a different way. I had a lovely conversation about this with Graham, who pretty much created most of the stuff that is Warhammer that we have today. And he was stunned at a lot of what he perceived to be the racist views of how, and sexist in particular views, of how people were interpreting his work. And he's like, no, it's a polytheistic world. This isn't what it should be like. People are viewing it very much as a medieval world. It's not medieval. It uses the Renaissance. It uses the medieval worlds and places, but it's not what that is. And if you take a look through Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition, for example, it's surprisingly egalitarian. There are all manner of women in positions of power, far more so than would come later the case in later editions of Warhammer. If we move to 4th edition, Warhammer Fantasy Battle, for example, they remove almost all of the female electric counts, bar one, because if anything, they move it closer to medieval and Renaissance, and then they pull it away again afterwards as they go back to the original version, which was effectively much more gender equality than we have in the real world. And it's important that if that is the world that you're attempting to portray, you use the correct language to do that. So I fully get if you don't like that, and apologies if it upsets you. I'm not someone who gets upset about this stuff. I'm always trying to create the best stuff with the material that we have in hand, and that won't always land with everybody, and that's okay, I suppose. Alrighty, so we're now down to What time am I at as well? Got to check the time. Yeah, I'm okay, yeah. If you had to, what Warhammer city would you... Oh, I wouldn't live in any of them. God, they're all terrible. What Warhammer city would I live in? They are all terrible. Now, for all I'd just been previously saying about the ists and the horror, the Warhammer world's full of all manner of bigotries and horrors and just dangers. These gods are real and they are often terrible. And they're not good. The elves are the worst. Humans are the worst. I mean, obviously all the other species are the worst. No matter where you go, it's pretty horrific. There's loads of places I'd love to see. I mean, I'd love to see Lothern. I'd love to see a really well-made Altdorf, which I don't think we've had one yet in any writing or computer game in a fashion that matches everything that's been described. So I wouldn't want to live in any, and I know that's a terrible answer. It's a bit of a bullshit answer, but it's the truth. Turnpike, hello. Hello in return. One thing I've been worried about is whether or not the souls of demon princes are assimilated into their patron god. If so, it seems like a terrible idea. The answer is yes. Bluntly, yes. If you are a demon prince of one of the gods, you are a part of that god. Now, that doesn't mean you lose your individuality. That also doesn't mean you have individuality. It's a complicated affair when you move over to something that is effectively now an etheric entity. Your life that you had as a mortal has come to an end. You have ascended and become effectively a minor god. And as a minor god, you have dedicated yourself to one particular way of life beforehand, and the god that you have sworn yourself to effectively agrees that you are just like it, and you become a part of it. And the same way that demons are part of the greater god, greater demons are part of the greater god, the demon princes are also, in the great court of the individual hells, part of that deity. If you wish to view gods like that, but do be aware that different writers have taken slightly different views for how these express. Now you might go, but wait a minute, there are certain demon princes who have rebelled or gone against. Yes, and there are certain gods who are, in many respects, epitomized by the fact that they epitomize, say, change or rebellion, or taking something to an excess, or just giving up, or just going to war, which means that they can not just rebel, they can move against their core components frequently, but that doesn't mean they're not a part of that god. And yeah, it is a terrible idea. Ascension is not everything it's described as by some of the chaos gods, for example. Quinn, we're very excited for the Marienburg book this year. Yay! What's your favorite hook or lore from that city? My players love it too much to ignore it. Marienburg, I love Marienburg deeply. I have played there more times than I care to mention. I have very fond memories of the very first Marienburg articles that were put together by, again, Graham Davis, all the way back for White Dwarf, and then they were all put together. Anthony Reagan did the first edition Marienburg book, which I adored. It was the first time that I read a city book and went, this for me is worthwhile. And we'd had before that the City of Chaos book, or the Middenheim City of the White Wolf book, depending on which edition you went with. And that one was fine. It was good. I liked it, but it just felt like it was an expansion for the enemy within. This felt like it was its own place that stood on its own shoulders, probably on its own feet, and justified its existence. My favorite hook from the whole thing, or lore from that city, I mean, I quite like Riker's Isle, just because it's a bad joke and it makes me laugh. Yeah, totally. Yeah, quite. Yeah. Let's just not get caught up in that. So, Aleph, any thoughts on how to portray Nurgle outside the tested disease profile, leaning towards despair, etc.? Yes, we picked up a couple of that. In fact, I would argue, if you're looking for a nice idea about how things could be done a bit differently, go check the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay starter set. Go check the story for the elf character that's in the back. So there's 10 adventures inside that book. The first one is the longer intro adventure. Then there's 4, or is it 3? 2-page adventures and a bunch of 1-page adventures. The 1-page adventures at the back are quick adventures for each one of the PC pre-gens that you get inside the box set. And the one for the elf, Amris's one, Amris Emberfell, is, I think, a really nice way for you to look at a different route for Nurgle. But you tend to find that Nurgle, in general, just look at any description of the god, look for the adjectives, and then create something around a different adjective to disease. Despair, for example, is a very good one. They also have a core, an unexpected aspect of fraternity and grouping together in your despair and your despondency. So yeah, there's lots of things you could do with that one. But yeah, pop that one out. Tanuel, I agree with the point that if you do it well, yeah, agreed. After all, a well-written setting is what counts. It is not being done well recently, Veilguard. Thanks, Andy. You know what? I actually agree. I like Veilguard. I have the all the tat version of it kicking around here. I'm going to bring it out because it's actually pretty fucking cool. All the tat edition, Veilguard. Yeah. I have no issues with all of the things that Veilguard was wanting to add to its fantasy, largely because this wasn't new. Dragon Age is a long and relatively hoary setting now. Its last game was 10 years before Veilguard came out. And the last game had Krem in it, who was a transgender character, for example. The storytelling in Veilguard is largely where it was let down. It was basically painting a giant target upon its chest. And that's okay if that's what you're trying to do. And if you want to be creating something that's controversial or something that is directly throwing certain aspects of the stories they're telling in a fashion that will purposefully annoy, then it very much did its job. Now, I personally played through it and didn't care, but I know a lot of people who did. And the fact that they had that response shows that there was something that needed to be at least looked at and discussed, whether that was on the marketing side and what they were pitching it as, or whether it was something else. But they were clearly scared of it. They, on their reviews, said there are certain aspects of this game we don't want you to mention in the reviews. And that's just wrong. That means that they have done something that perhaps they shouldn't have if they're scared to have people talk about their game for what it is. Having said that, personally, not an issue with any of it, but I did have an issue of how much of it was pitched, because it felt, actually, to your earlier point, very modern. And it didn't feel modern in a way that made sense within the game world that they'd already built. It felt just like we're just going to throw all this modern stuff in and there we go. And it didn't feel like it fit the realm as well as it could have. I think they could have told exactly the same story. And by the way, I didn't like the story of Veilguard as much as I'd like, because sadly I bought the art book, and the art book told a better story than the story that they went with. But they could have told their story with all the same characters doing largely the same thing, and it would not have had the same backlash. Of course, there'll be backlash. There's certain people who don't want to see certain topics ever discussed. I'm not that person. I know lots of gay people, transgender people, lots of every sort of people, different races, different backgrounds, different ethnicities. I'm happy with all of them, and they definitely make sense in a fantasy realm as well, because hell, one of the very first artifacts I got when I was a kid playing Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay allowed me to change my gender. One of my characters I played in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition was literally a man who turned into a woman because he had a magic ring, and that was cool. This is a setting where that sort of thing should not be seen in the same light as it is in the real world, because it's a world of magic where things happen and it's complicated and it's different and it's cool. And it didn't feel magical and exciting and interesting. If anything, it felt almost mundane by comparison. And that's good, because mundane is good and making it just part of an overall story that's not special. But they didn't. They put too much focus on it. They basically kept on saying, it's this, it's this, it's this, in a fashion that made the story weaker. And I was very regretful for what Veilguard did, because it was fine as an idea and everything about it was cool, but it just wasn't as well written as it could have been. And I know that that's not necessarily the most popular opinion amongst some, but that's where I largely land. I both have no problems with anything they did, and simultaneously look at what they did and wish they'd done it better. Go figure. It is it's a difficult thing to write, and they should probably have given it a bit more time, maybe. I don't know. Where are we? That was... so I believe I must probably be here. Also, again, thanks very much for the comment. Aleph, just emptying out the coffers to say, more LAWhammer! More is coming. And thank you very much for saying so. I reckon we may end up reaching about 200 episodes by the time we've finished the first campaign. We're currently at like episode 109, somewhere around there. I'll be up, once we've got the next set of side streams done, about 110, something like that. What time am I at? Well, aware of the time. I finally started watching, and I'm love. Congrats, there. And let me just bring up Benjamin's comments here. Oh, just before I say that, thank you, because all existing Dragon Age fans I know like Veilguard. I like Veilguard. I'm going to be very blunt here. I thought it wasn't as well written as it could have been in many places, and then my biggest issue was I saw what the game could have been because I got the art book. And the game that they were building in the art book, story-wise, was significantly better than the game that we got. My biggest issue with Veilguard was that it just had little depth. It was very shallow. Each one of the core stories wasn't given enough depth. The core romances, for example, at least 2 of them are almost perfunctory. They're not well written, and they only have like a scene or 2 that in no way feels like it's satisfying in the slightest. The writing for some aspects of it was just not deep enough, and some of the language chosen was exceedingly modern. Now, I have no problem with the modern language as long as it makes sense within the context of the games themselves, but they had taken quite a different view in both Dragon Age, well, both in 1, 2, and to a degree 3, although 3 was acting almost as a bridge. I liked it. I've completed it twice. I've got the all tap version. I've got the art book. But I'm also someone that's quite willing to lay criticism on things that I like. You should see me go off on one, for example, a Mass Effect. I'm wearing a Mass Effect top, for goodness sake. Here we go, N7. But I have loads of criticisms, and that's okay, because we're all allowed to enjoy things in our own ways. There's no right or wrong way to enjoy a thing. I enjoy Veilguard. I will play it again. I do think that the writing wasn't as good as it could have been. I do think, though, that because I've now accepted that when I play it the next time, I'll enjoy even more because I'll be aware of its flaws and I'll be able to enjoy it for what it is rather than what I expected. I, for example, feel like they massively misused characters like Morrigan, for example. Morrigan was terribly used, and the lack of connections to the 3 previous games was, for me, just a crime. But that's just my own personal preference. So hopefully that helps. Let's pop up, just since we've been on this one. My most proud as a Dragon Age super fan was that you could not contain sufficient angry grey elves. Yeah. We need more angry greys. We should have had, why is his name escaped from me? From Dragon Age 2. Our Tevinter elf slave. He should have been in. He's fucking amazing. Very disappointed he wasn't in, but nevertheless. Moving down to Quinn. Question from my wife. Hello there, Quinn's wife. If you were to design a chaos cult from the ground up, where would you start with planning? So first, choose your chaos god, and that might not be one of the big 4. Then decide what that cult is, if it's Tzeentch for. Oh, no, it's what that cult does. And that's generally looking at some of the core things that we'll do on a nightly basis. Then once you've done what the cult does, think about what lies behind the cult. What are the secrets? What lies behind the facade? We've got a bunch of examples of slightly different cults inside the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay starter set, since that seems to be the book that I'm going to this week, where we've got a couple of different Slaanesh, Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch cults expressing in different ways. Look at those, because they're not very deep. There's only like a very short description and a couple of adventure hooks for how you can then use them during playing. It's the adventure hooks that add that little bit of extra depth. But broadly, all you need to worry about is what is it doing, why is it doing it, what are the secrets behind it, and behind that, you'll be really looking at ensuring that whatever you decide it's doing drills in very closely with one of the core adjectives to whatever particular chaos god you're working towards supporting with this cult. And often with cults, and something that's rarely seen through, I would look to deciding, most cults don't necessarily know they're proper cults, particularly Slaanesh ones. What happens when eventually the demon comes, or some equivalent? I think one of the better cults in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay is the Ordo Septenarius in Shadows over Bugenhafen. Largely because none of them know that they're a member of a Tzeentch cult. And I think that is a fine example of how things can be properly presented. And it's a good place to begin if you're trying to create something a little bit different. They aren't these cackling bad guys who are wandering around going, I want to kill some worship, I'll bring down the wall, or whatever it is they happen to be doing. There is a place for those, but the average person of the Empire is just a dupe who's doing something without any awareness of how damaging it is and where they're eventually going to lead to, until eventually their soul is claimed and now they have no choice and they're lost in it. And I think that the reason why that's such a popular choice by many of the writers is because most of them are relatively left-wing, and they look at the real world indoctrinations of people and how it works, and people who have been unindoctrinated in the stories they have about the various cults they may have been involved in, or alternatively the political movements that they were involved in, and the extremes that people would go to. And they didn't need a chaos god to do that, which is why sometimes they make better, at least starting points, than, for example, going with our moustache twirling, chaos worshipping bad guy. Watchdog, what has been the most cathartic NPC moment for you in LAWhammer? For me, it was your Tales of War episodes. Cathartic NPC moment. That's a toughie. It's actually a toughie. Yeah, I often don't know where the tales are going to go, because I like to let the players have quite a lot of freedom when we're doing our tales. Cathartic is a particular... Cathars. What's my best Southern France nonsense? Okay, so I'm going to take this one slightly differently, Watchdog, and answer a slightly different question, which is, what was my most satisfying, which goes in a slightly different route, for the way everything landed, which is very different to the one I enjoyed most, which was very different to the ones that I personally enjoyed playing, but it was something that added something to the game that was unexpected. And that would probably be one of the tales with Birdie, when she goes to the Estalian monastery to drop off the again, huge spoilers, but to drop off the Skaven slave there. And she goes with Margarita, and she finds out that Margarita has a past. And she came out of that going, I think I like Margarita. I didn't expect this. And Kath at the time wasn't a great fan of Margarita. She was like, yeah, she's just that person. And she came out of that one going, I really like her. She's great. She's got a lot of character. I think she rocks. And that for me was really quite satisfying. So I'm going to go with that one. I hope that helps a bit. Right, so that was Watchdog. I think I'm out, so I'm going to dive up to another bunch of cues that popped in. Let's see if I can find any. LAWhammer, also any advice on how to use dogs and horses from your blog? My players want to use them and I love them, but I'm afraid of killing someone's pet. It's an issue. Have a conversation with them first. If they are upset with you killing their pet, then possibly you shouldn't let them have one. But if they really want one because that's what will make them enjoy the game, then just don't kill their pet. Now that might not sound very Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but we all have things we don't like and do like, and we're here to enjoy ourselves. One of the discussions we had right at the very beginning of LAWhammer was, what did we all accept and not accept during play? And it was decided pretty early on. There were certain lines we were not going to cross because it would upset some of the players. You always want to have that conversation first, not after, because it's very easy to upset a player because you, for example, kill their horse, and then the player goes, I'm done, or worse, cries, because they didn't realize how much they had invested in this thing that they had. Now, I have in my past made many errors. We are all human. We say things that we probably regret. We do things we probably regret. And I have done many things in my role-playing past that I wish I hadn't done. Almost all of them would have been resolved if I simply had a conversation first. So my piece of advice to this one is, have a discussion as to how you would like to use them. And through doing so, hopefully, that will mean that there'll be no problems. Because if they all go, if my dog dies, it's not a problem, then it's not a problem. And then you can also, if you think that they might not be entirely truthful with themselves, bring it up as you do realize if you're going down here, your dog might die. And if they go, oh, I'm not so happy about that, then you know that there's something else we need to discuss. On the flip side of that, if they say, though, I really want to have a dog, but he can't die, then you're going to have a discussion as how you can make the best use of that character in-game, whether the character should instead be taken away, or something else should occur, or, you know, just goes off to a nice friendly home elsewhere. Yeah, probably. Right, let's look for another cue. Here's a cue. LAWhammer, it seems like you generally avoid going into the subject, but my curiosity compelled me to ask. Oh, gosh, Hendrik, did I miss your earlier question? Now you're making me feel, oh no, I'm not seeing the question that I'm referencing. Oh man, sorry Hendrik. I appear to be just pulling up posts that have no, oh, it's the worst. Sorry. Hobbit, how excited are you for the recently-ish teased Grand Cathay for the old world? Personally, it might be the push I need to start recollecting miniatures. Stop generally when the old Dark Elf. Yes, so I think Grand Cathay is going to be the first real test of the old world to see how big it actually is, because it's all too easy to just borrow your friend's book and use your old army, meaning that the game probably has far more customers than anyone in Games Workshop is certain of, because they can play the game without buying anything. And that is arguably a problem. So how do we know for certain? The first army that is entirely new, and that's going to show them how healthy their game is. Personally, on my side, I'm super freaking excited for our first new army since the Ogre Kingdoms. So, oh, hell yeah. Hey, Hendrik, for having missed your previous one. Hi, Andy. You mentioned in the past you left C7 mid Enemy Within, yes, and others followed. Yes, you never really went into it. I didn't, which I understand, but my curiosity got the better of me. Are you willing to elaborate? I am not. I had a lot of heartbreak and issues with it back in the past. Some people decided that they no longer, because they were aware of how everything went down, they no longer wanted to work on the game either. I actually said that I would work on all of the Enemy Within, and we came to agreement to do so. But things happened, and we didn't do it in the end. It was a complicated, horrible position that started off with what appeared to be a nice, simple issue that needed to be resolved, turned into something else, and then when I found out what actually happened, when I spoke to other people involved, I found out I had been lied to again, and again, and again, and again, and I was done. So that's as much as I can say about it. Right. I've already covered that one. Here's another one. What are the odds of giant mercenaries joining the armies of man? And if so, could they be trained to use a colossal cannon as a mobile siege engine, just like the aesthetic? What are the odds? Not high, but it certainly happens. For example, over in Middenheim, there's a giant that's used to load the big gigantic cannon that they have there that was first presented inside the Storm of Chaos army list for Warhammer 6th edition, off the top of my head. Yeah, 6th edition. So yes, it's something that can indeed happen, and they are often not so much trained, but most certain, yeah, trained. That's probably the best word for it, Floodwater. They are definitely given direction to do things that smaller folks cannot. Hobbit, also, I've been wondering, is there any place in Warhammer Fantasy World where you could find Finnic influences, language culture-wise? Only ones I've seen are Norscan names. Yeah, and yes, that is sadly the only place. And if anyone ever sat down and did a big, proper Norska, that is where you would find it, Hobbit. As it currently stands, though, it is at best very poor references by people who haven't done any research, so thus just grab a bunch of random names that sound to their ear Scandinavian. This is something that upsets me deeply. I have gone on record on more than one occasion about using other people's cultures and using them sensitively. Now, this is going to cause issues for people saying woke again. No, bullshit. Your very comment here shows why we need to use these things sensitively, and we need to use them properly. If you're using something that comes from someone else's culture, you need to understand it, you need to understand what it does, you need to understand how best to use it. And when you're using other people's languages, other people's cultures, ethnicities, and histories, and you're using parts of that, you've got to understand why it's a part of the world that you're writing for and exactly what sort of impact it has. It's not just a simple matter of, I'll grab a couple of names, that'll do, away you go. If you're doing that, which tribes is that associated with? Why? What sort of naming practices do they have? Where did the language come from? What tribes did they have originally? This is something that the empires had done to a degree. We know, for example, that the Teutoburg tribe, they originally came from the World's Edge Mountains, came across there, and they are one of the original peoples that brought in the heavily old Germanic style language types that influences early Reichsspiel, where the strongest one came from the Umberigans, who came from a very similar part of the world. They've had a bit of depth. We know, for example, that the Ostrogoths, who would originally be way over in Ostermark, they came from the south. They are almost certainly descendants of, for example, Nehekhara. It's one of the reasons why Mor is the core deity that lies at the heart of much of the Ostrogoths. So they come with a host of different language influences that came through some 4,000 years ago. Well, 3,000 years ago when they moved up into the right basin. So a bit of thought at collating it all, I think, makes a big difference. And sadly, it hasn't often been done. So you don't have much beyond that, I'm sorry to say. I would love to see X-Factor or Artel Historian Games Designers Rookery stream. Glory to House Steiner and the Commonwealth. Yes, quite. Adrian Ward on Discord. Oh, hi, MP in Discord. Any stories about Plesk? Could it be a magical forest with the new landmark only available to Ostankia and Total War? Sounds like Widow is a spirit and is down there like Ulrich and Middenheim. That wasn't my original intention when I created much of what is now Ostankia for Total War. The Widow was not a spirit that was down there per se like Ulrich. It was significantly bigger, worse, better, depending upon how one looks at it. The Gospodars are another tribe of humans that came across the World Edge Mountains from what is effectively the periphery of the realm of chaos. And they were plucked free, the Gospodars being one of the worst tribes as they were before, exceedingly warlike, exceedingly powerful. And they came down to Mother Kislev for a reason. So my general parts here would be go with your own thing. I'm interested to see what Games Workshop eventually do when they release their new version of Kislev, because it's going to update all of the work that I did previously, and I'm interested to see which direction they go in. I'm going to double check down for the super chats just in case there is any, because I've not been paying attention. Oh, there isn't any. Excellent. Let's drive back again. Let's go to my first stat that I find. Here's one. Oh, no, that's not to me. Let's move down to... There's one. Have I done this one? I also feel there should be more female ancestor gods for the dwarves. Oh, you have no idea how much this annoys me. So, Agar 89. There is a massive gender imbalance with the dwarfs. Sex imbalance would be better, in that only one female is born for every, depending which numbers we go from, which book, 5 to 8 dwarves. Meaning that there are far fewer women, which means that female ancestors are much more common than male. I mean, obviously there's the same number going back, but the female ancestor is the only certainty that you have going all the way back. The fact that there is not more matrilineal stuff with the dwarves seems very, very strange. And I think that it was nicely discussed over in the stream that Lore Master Sotek had with Lindsay. So if you go check into one of our very, very first ones in the modern era of Lorebeards, a stream with... I'm going to have to bring up the thing. The stream with Lore Master Sotek and Lindsay, you will find one where they were discussing different species, and they discussed the dwarves, and they discussed in particular why that one's quite important. Now, I've got 3 minutes 44 seconds to go before my next stream, so I'll quickly say that, dump into my last super chats, and then go. Very little time remaining. So, number one, I'm about to go and do a stream about using Revolution in Europlay games with Andy, Lindsay, Mark Gibbons, and myself. It's going to be awesome. If you are over on Twitch, you will probably get dumped over there as a raid, assuming that I can remember how to do that. So that's number one. Let's just double check. I've got that laid up, so hopefully that will go. Number two, do buy Dark Deeds. Also, thanks very much for coming along to my celebration. 50,000 streams, yeah. Quick last ones. Love Lexicon, it's great. That's slang, brilliant. Any tips to start incorporating it in your games naturally? Speak to your players about how they'd like to do it. Sigmar sausage is always funny. Lord Mazamundi, I always wanted more of the old world as other cultures find remnants in Lisbon cities. Yeah, they span nearly the entire planet. I agree. Is there a Warhammer god? I'm sorry, he's not seeing name running very quickly because I'm almost out of time. Is the Warhammer god of severe depression, crippling inability to go on, and gradual lack of faith in anything that gives one an ability to go on? Nurgle is your best bet there. Sorcerer friend, hi Andy, congratulations on the 50k, thank you so much. Was the LAWhammer redesigned magic system spells ever released? No, we're not even actually using the full redesign even in our own game, because it went through one redesign then another, and we were quite happy with the rules that are existing. The Bright College has got on my ancient blog a bunch of spells up in it and an entire setup that you could use in your games right now over on Blogger. I am, however, conversant. I only have around about 2 minutes before that stream goes. They haven't started there yet, which means I can't actually, you know, do the connecting streamy thing. So hey, I'll just keep on chatting here until we go. So let me see if there's anyone there. Do priests using prayers temporarily express godhood in a similar fashion as elven avatars? If not, what is the difference? No, they do not. They are quite different. What is that's a really deep question to answer in the dying moments of a stream. The answer is it's not exactly the same. Alistair Paley, how do hedge witches, blessed few that have joined, infiltrated the schools of magic, cast the lore of hedgecraft spells that they know? Is there a stigma rule against them? It's not just a stigma, it's illegal. They absolutely cannot do it, but that doesn't mean that they can't. They're not allowed to do it. If they were caught doing it, they'll be witch hunted down and killed. It's just not acceptable. They are not supposed to use any magic that they may have learned before arriving inside the colleges. Once they get into the colleges, they get attached to one of the individual lores, and that's all they're supposed to be able to do. But they have infiltrated, and they can do more than that. There is about 1 minute left. They're about to go live over on that side. So I will end with a thanks so much for the 50k views in our first stream. It was absolutely marvelous. I will see you all. Oh, they haven't started. Why haven't they started? I'm not sure if they're going to start. Okay, well, I'm just going to finish off on this side and say thanks all, you rock, and I'm going to go dive over to the other side. I will hopefully see you over on the Rookery. That's inside the Rookery over on YouTube and Twitch. Go speak to us. I will see you over there. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.